Black Myth Wukong on PlayStation 5. It's been a mystery until release, and we've gotten our hands on it, and, well, there's quite a lot to say. Now, I'm not taking point here. My friend and colleague Oliver McKenzie has all the details for you. So, Oliver, how you doing there?
Yes, I'm doing great, and I'm ready to talk about one of the strangest games that I've seen technically in recent console history for sure, if not ever.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said here. Just to prime the ground a little bit, we did see a little bit of preview footage of this as published by IGN, I believe, Chinese outlet, and it's actually spawned more questions than answers. Another little prepping here is that the PC version has a number of technical quirks, and our question while covering that PC version in a high-end situation was, how do they translate a lot of these really high-end features and performance requirements into a PlayStation 5? So we have the answers, and they're not all good. So let's start, I would say, immediately with the differences here in the various modes. Now, how many modes are in the game, Oliver?
3 modes. Do you want me to go through them?
I'll go through them all.
Okay. There are 3 modes. There's performance, quality, and balance. Not balanced, balance. And those are all available at 60 hertz output. So in terms of visual differences between the modes outside of resolution, there really isn't as much as you'd think. I kind of struggled to see the differences. Like, you look at the game's cascaded shadow maps, which it's using on console, and the cascade line for the highest res shadows occurs at like the same distance between all 3 modes. Actual resolution looks quite similar. And they all use screen space shadows for some things, like small bits of geometry here and there to kind of fill in the cracks, because CSMs are not going to resolve that detail, obviously. Textures look about the same, models look about the same. The only difference that I really saw there was that at a distance, the quality mode resolves a little bit more detail, but I think that's just the way that Nanite tends to work at higher resolutions. I don't know that it's a settings difference. There were some areas where I did notice a little bit more of a substantial difference, like the Lumen GI, which looked a little bit more refined in the quality mode. But again, very possibly they're just running at a higher resolution. I also noticed some differences in the SSR in one scene where performance and quality looked pretty similar, but balance weirdly looked a little bit sharper. But I think that might just be some weird variance, because in other scenes I didn't notice it. So I'm sure there are other changes in there. And for an exact settings match with the PC version, Mohammed Ryan is looking into the code with more depth. But at the moment, the settings differences, again, outside of resolution, that we do see between the modes, they're not very significant as far as I could see. They all look quite similar in that respect.
Yeah, on PC, though, this game is really heavy on the GPU side of things, and I will wholeheartedly recommend anyone there to take advantage of something like DLSS or TSR or XeSS. And I imagine, like a lot of UE5 games to date, that this game is also taking advantage of modern upscaling techniques.
Yeah, so the game, basically, as far as I can tell, it's leaning a lot on FSR in particular. But basically, I'll run through the image quality statistics for you here. So I'll start with the good stuff and work towards the bad, because there's a mix of good and bad here, maybe a little bit more towards that latter category, but there's some good stuff as well. So the quality mode appears subjectively as a 4K image. It's using upsampling like a lot of games. The highest resolution that I got out of it was 1584p looking right up at the sky. But I spotted one shot at 1296p and another one at 1224p, so there does appear to be dynamic res in this mode at present. And I think it probably spends a lot of time around 1440p, because that's the number that came up a few times. It appears it's doing that through FSR's image upscaling component, so probably FSR 3, I'd imagine, but not the frame generation component. It doesn't look that bad in stills. It can look quite good, but in motion it's quite messy, and I think there are 2 key elements to that problem, right? The first is just issues with the temporal upsampling component that they are using, which I think is FSR 3 here, because it doesn't handle aliasing in motion very well, or even really at all. Like, it doesn't work that well relative to XeSS or DLSS. And especially when you've got stuff like alpha textures or fur or anything that doesn't really have the motion vectors that you need, the game is like kind of a bit of a mess there. Like in the fight with the game's first major boss, it's just like not really doing too well there at all in terms of image quality. It looks quite aliased. And the second is post-processing, because post-processing in this game, like Alex noted in his video, which include like the motion blur and the weapon impact effects I noticed, the weapon impact distortion, they tend to be dithered. And that makes the game kind of sparkly and speckly and messy in motion. And it gets worse with motion blur on, but it's still not great with motion blur off, because a lot of the hits have that post-process distortion effect applied. But yeah, here it's not very good in the quality mode, and it kind of doesn't get any better from here.
Yeah, and based upon the footage you showed me as well too, the performance mode takes a trait of the PC version that I'm not at all fond of, and that is the kind of over sharpening. Bizarrely, the quality and the balance mode, as it is called, look kind of more normalized in terms of the level of sharpness you see and the haloing effect around edges.
Yeah.
But the performance mode, if you put it right next to that balance mode, for example, you'll see that it just looks so much over sharpened. That's an issue on the PC version, and it's really bizarre to see it only applying to one of the modes here. I really don't know if that's oversight or something they desired.
Yeah, that sharpening is a big issue. And in that balanced mode, basically it's 1080p with no dynamic res. Like, it doesn't count differently at all. And it's got like the same problems, but you get the dithering issues at that lower resolution. It's not too exceptional, but like you said, the performance mode does have some bigger issues. So that's really where things go off the rails in a number of ways, not just the sharpening. But the sharpening is cranked up super, super high in that mode. And I don't know why, because otherwise it often looks very similar to the balance mode. But the image sharpening is way more intense and gives the game kind of like a crunchy look, like a deep fried look almost. It looks very weird. It looks very weird. And yeah, I counted it out. It's always 1080p as far as I can tell. Again, I think there might be dynamic res in there because the dynamic res is in the quality mode. So maybe it's in here too, but I couldn't spot it even in the more intense moments in the game. But it gets more interesting from there because the performance mode uses frame generation. And there are tons of signs of it that you can see all over the place. Like at the corner of the frame with motion blur on, there's visible artifacting. Little particles have lots of artifacting in them. And if you go frame by frame or even just watch it in real time, frankly, you will see a lot of artifacts during fast motion where clearly there's a real frame and an interpolated frame and a real frame and an interpolated frame. It is kind of an abuse of this technology because they're trying to use it to hit 60 FPS, which we'll talk about in a moment. The base frame rate is only 30 FPS, and this is a really fast-paced game, a lot of action, a lot of violence to it, a lot of movement, and it just does not love this technique. It does not love it.
Yeah, 30 to 60 FPS frame interpolation or generation is always it's very situation dependent, whether or not it can be useful, and it requires high quality. FSR 3 frame generation, as we know, is a little bit lower quality than DLSS 3, where it's already a stretch to get that 30 to 60 to look good. And then you combine it with the serious amount of transparencies, fast motion, and the sharpening, and then the motion blur, which has its artifacts of its own, and then the 1080p base resolution here, what it appears to be. It's really pushing the technology well beyond the breaking point of what I think is acceptable visually,
or intended,
based upon the footage used, or even intended. For example, AMD themselves say 60 to 120 conversions are what they aim for with the technology. NVIDIA, for example, has told us that they consider 40 to 80 a good sweet spot for their technology. I don't think FSR 3 is meant for 30 to 60, and when we get to the performance, we'll see some interesting reasons why this exists. But yeah, it obviously fulfills at least one goal there, but the visual goal is well missed, I would say.
Why don't we dive into that and talk about the performance mode first? Because I think that's the most interesting mode, and in some ways, actually, surprisingly, the most defensible from a performance perspective, which is something that is quite a surprise, I'm sure, to hear that, but it is, in my opinion, possibly the truth here. It does mostly achieve 60 FPS. That's the good news. In typical play, it's mostly 60 FPS. Now, there are some traversal stutters, but they don't seem as bad here as Alex noted on the PC platform. They're not a huge deal. You see little drops here and there throughout various points in the run. Like, they're quite repeatable, and you can see them all over the place, but they're not a gigantic deal. It's not ideal, but it's not really this game's worst issue by far. When the game does drop frames, like in these bigger combat moments that you're seeing here, it drops pretty hard. So you go from 60 FPS to one moment to 40 FPS next. But during these frame drops, the game does usually maintain frame gen because I am still seeing those artifacts, those characteristic frame gen artifacts. But there is one sequence in the game, which is the introduction, where it does appear to drop frame gen entirely for possibly image quality related reasons. I think if I had to guess if there's a reason, it might be image quality related, because it would probably be a mess with all that transparency going about. It wouldn't work well, especially you got that 30 FPS base frame rate, you got the FSR 3, it's just not a great combination of factors there, and of course the 1080p resolution. But elsewhere, the game does seem to maintain it for the most part. That's one thing, but basically, despite the artifacts and occasional performance hiccups, it's actually quite smooth. I think the biggest issue with the performance mode, at least to me personally, is probably latency, because you're getting the frame rate response of a 60 FPS game, but with input response that is likely worse than the game at 30 FPS based on what we know about frame generation technologies. And there's a perceptibly laggy feeling to the controls, and it doesn't feel that great even with camera sensitivity turned up to compensate. I still felt like this is a weirdly laggy game. It does feel a little bit off-putting if you're used to 60 FPS games that do not use frame generation techniques, where the input response is usually a lot faster than this.
I feel like them hitting 60 is not such a big surprise here. Usually, most of the time, minus those moments you talked about earlier, like when you get in that big boss fight with that wolfy-looking creature, when on the PC, even on a high-end GPU, when that character or many of the characters that are covered in real-time dynamic fur get close to the camera, it gets a lot more expensive, and you can see the frame rate dipping there. I'm not too surprised by that, but I'm also not too surprised that the game is hitting a consistent 60, because really all you need is 30 FPS plus a little bit to get to a proper frame gen 60 with FSR 3 frame generation. So it hitting that performance metric is good, but at the same time, you're looking at a lot of these caveats to it being a good 60. Like, you're not getting the input latency. And in a game like this one, some of the mid-tier boss characters you'll be fighting against, and there's a difficulty scale in this game. You have to hit dodges pretty often to get away from attacks. And I feel like the input latency there would be pretty intense, actually, to escape a number of dodges.
Yeah, it's not ideal. But if you do want better input latency, I have good news for you, because the balance mode is actually better in that respect. It has input response. It's actually pretty decent. Now, there are some minor blips in frame time for traversal stutters that I noted, but they're actually more perceptible here than at the 60 FPS mode, because the base frame rate is higher, right? So you're actually getting more of that apparent stutter in there. But as you can probably see through this footage, the base frame rate here, the frame rate they're targeting, is 45 frames per second, which is totally bizarre. You basically get constant stutter, like frame time variance all over the place. Like, it's just a constant struggle there. You're getting constant, basically, changes in the way the game responds and feels. The only other game I can think that has ever done this, to my knowledge, to my recollection, the only game that has ever done this is the port of specifically Arkham Asylum in the Return to Arkham collection, not Arkham City, but just Arkham Asylum on Xbox One X. That also did this weird 45 FPS target. Didn't work there at all, doesn't work now. It's just a horrible choice. Like, I don't think it's defensible, but like, yeah, it's just so strange.
Yeah, so for those in the audience who don't know why it's such a bad choice, this game is targeting 60 hertz with its output. The PlayStation 5 cannot change that. And displayed on a normal fixed refresh rate display, there is never a frame time window in there where it matches up with the refresh rate. And so it will show one frame long and maybe too short, or, or vice versa, constantly the entire time. So no singular bit of motion will actually be linearly properly spaced. It'll always look like one, like fast and then short, fast, short, fast, long, and it never looks good. And this is why this frame rate no man's land between 30 and 60 for so long has dominated consoles. You had a 30 FPS game or you had a 60 FPS game, and you really didn't want deviations from that. So targeting 45 FPS is completely missing the boat. There's no reason to do that. Yeah.
Yes, it is. And there are some performance dips as well, like during heavy cutscenes, like that opening cutscene sequence, which is quite demanding, or really heavy combat, like that boss fight we always keep bringing up with the guy with the fur, the wolf guy. But the cap is the big issue here, in my opinion. Without that issue, if it ran at, let's say, 60 frames per second or 48 frames per second with VRR possibly, or any number of other possible considerations, if it ran at a stable 30 FPS, I think it would feel better than it does here. So then we get to the quality mode, the final mode that we have to discuss in performance terms. And this mode has the worst 30 FPS cap, I think, that I've ever seen. Assuming they're trying to hit 30 FPS, because I don't know what they're trying to hit or what they're trying to do here, to be honest with you, but I think they're trying to do something. It seems to hover between 31 and 36 FPS, 31 and 36. It doesn't spend much time at all, except when it's dropping at 30. So it does seem like they are trying to target some frame rate Here, it seems very odd, but it does seem like it's trying to do something involving holding a frame rate. The highest I've ever seen it go is 38 FPS when looking right up at the sky. So I think it is maybe doing something with a cap, but it's obviously not capped at 30 FPS properly. It just feels super strange to play. If it's not capped, conversely, then maybe there's something very strange going on with the load. But the fact that the load is so static and the frame rate numbers occur in a pretty narrow range, and you don't get that much variance when you do things that relieve the GPU of load, and you should really be getting better CPU-bound performance than this, all makes me think that there is something going on. But I do not know what. I do not know what.
Yeah, this is another kind of indefensible thing there. When Dragon's Dogma 2 launched on consoles, we and you very specifically in your video created like a list of things that they need to change. And in that case, it was implement a frame rate cap because the load of the game and the usual variance of frame rate that you would see kept it like slightly above 30 usually, but below 40. And here we're seeing something very similar. Whether or not there's some strange capping going on is hard to know. Yeah, because, if they cap the game at 45 FPS, maybe they're doing something else. And in this case, there's fixed refresh rate displays. If you're not displaying a frame 2 times at 30 FPS within a 60 hertz container of that 60 hertz display, which the PlayStation 5 supports for this mode, then you're going to get, once again, completely unsteady motion the entire time. And it'll be even, arguably more egregious than the other mode because it has the potential there of being really smooth, at least from a visual cadence. But it's not, because the capping is done either not at all or very extremely strangely. But your description here is essentially 2 modes which seem from a visual smoothness perspective extremely poor, and then a third mode which is visually smooth for the most part but has input latency concerns and visual quality concerns. Does that sound like a good conclusion?
That's the basic problem. And in that quality mode also, you do see some dips that can dip during intense moments, but it's really the issues with the capping or lack thereof that are the problem. I think it's that bizarre cap I do not understand. I would say that's a very accurate description of things, but there is one wrinkle here that some people might be expecting, because we do cover this a lot in modern console games, which is 120 hertz support and VRR support. So this game does not support either. If you go into 120 hertz when it's enabled in the PS5 settings, it does not turn on 120 hertz output when the game is on. Also, when you turn on the VRR setting, unless you force it on, the game does not turn on VRR, so it does not have explicit VRR support. I did try the game with VRR forced on, and of course that quality mode and the balance mode do not change because they are operating below 48 frames per second all the time. In the performance mode, I didn't find it terribly useful because it's usually operating at 60, and in those traversal stutter moments, you do still feel them because they are bigger frame time spikes. And I don't really think VR has much utility in that mode, or indeed in this title. But if you want to turn it on, you're perfectly free to. It just does not do anything for you at the moment. Now, if they implemented 120 hertz plus VR, perhaps we would see a resolution to some of these performance issues. But even still, it's like, well, if you improve things for people who own high-end displays, what are you going to do with people who are stuck with 60 hertz panels? They need to come up with a solution for, I think, for all users for sure with this game.
I'd agree with that. And when we kind of come full circle at this end of the video again, we'll talk about that, essentially what we would do in their shoes. Okay, so they've made sacrifices there in performance and resolution to achieve certain goals here with regards to, I don't know, what they have designed for the game. But how does it compare to that ultra high-end PC experience? Because there was a lot of really intense stuff that they're doing in the PC version there, specifically with like the full RT settings. So what have they brought to the console and how does it hold up?
Yeah, I really wanted to take a look at PC on its highest end settings because I really wanted to see what that feature gap is between the console experience on a good console like the PlayStation 5 and a high-end PC. So I have a PC with an i7 3700K and an RTX 4090. I ran the game at max settings, so that's cinematic settings plus the very high full RT option at 50% scale, so basically performance mode with DLSS, but no frame gen. So just running through that quickly. This isn't a comprehensive list of improvements, but I thought there were some things we could talk about. So the opening scene provides a great example of the kinds of things that PC can do that consoles probably can't do, which is that you get super fine ripples and super fine waves in that cloud layer, including fine little gusts of cloud or in weapon swings. That volumetric simulation looks way better on PC. Whereas the PS5 version is coarser and less detailed. The PS5 version still looks good, but PC offers a lot more detail. I think that's a really cool thing because you don't really see that often in real-time rendering, just a crazy volumetric simulation of that level. And I think it totally dovetails with the game's other particle systems and kind of the way that it generally works artistically with a lot of those elements.
Yeah, I think that's probably very expensive, both in memory and in terms of what it's requiring of the GPU to do in that moment. So it does make sense that they would cut that there. One thing that I was a little bit surprised to see based upon your footage, though, so that seems like a sensible cut. But one thing that I did notice in the footage you sent me comparing PC to console was that in a lot of the shots, texture quality looked kind of reduced in the PlayStation 5 version. So there was a good cut there with the volumetrics. It makes sense. But with the texture quality, basically every single shot that you showed of textures up close, or even just the default camera distance, you could notice that there was degradation there on the PlayStation 5 version, even in the quality mode that wasn't there on PC. And here, this is awkward because usually Unreal Engine 5, due to its virtual texturing system, especially on nanite objects, which this game is using a lot of, all over the place, usually that will make it so that it's streaming in just enough for the resolution to keep the texture resolution high. And we've seen in the past that especially UE5 games compare well to the highest settings on PC for texture. So here, them having to reduce that makes me wonder a little bit exactly about what the optimization goals are for this game. Because reducing texture quality on something like the PlayStation 5, which has a good amount of memory for things like textures, is not something we see too often. So that's a bit of a bad thing, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely weird because, like you said, we don't typically see that as a concession, even when you're dealing with like GPUs with like 8 gigabytes of VRAM or even 6 gigabytes of VRAM. Sometimes it's a very comparable experience, which other game engines would struggle with. UE5 seems to cope very well with. So it's a little strange, a little weird. You do see that difference up close or even at moderate distances, like you said. I'd say if you're just looking at PS5, it's not going to be like a huge issue, but if you're comparing them, it's a little strange. You also see some differences in like foliage. So what I noted is that PC has denser foliage with less obvious pop-in, and obviously you do see some pop-in with the foliage because the game is not using nanite for those elements, unlike the opaque geometry, so you actually do see a fair bit of pop-in for those elements. PC is much better. I think, Alex, you noted that those settings are really expensive on PC, so that makes some sense. Yeah.
Mohammed's taking a point on that right now, but the early performance numbers show that reducing foliage quality is one of the great ways to get back performance, along with a couple other things. Another thing, obviously, this goes without saying, but the full RT option on PC, as your footage here shows, also very different in some aspects. You showed off like indirect lighting, and like this little cave scenario here really shows off the little pixel per pixel precision there on smaller details that the SDFs won't necessarily catch always. Yes. There's something I pointed out in my video as well too, based on the PC version, as well as the fact that you're going to be getting those ray trace shadows versus the cascaded shadow maps that you don't otherwise get. And there's multiple benefits to that. Less flicker, a more consistent level of quality across the board, as well as when you move forward in the world, you don't see the really obvious cascade shadow line. Here they are not using virtual shadow maps, which UE5 offers. I presume it's because the cost, or because they're using an earlier engine version, or maybe because there's some sort of incompatibility. But it's actually kind of a shame not to see it, at least in the quality mode here, for Black Myth Wukong.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the water, which obviously you have the improvements to reflections and caustics that I think Alex covered in really great detail in his video. And yeah, I mean, I think like the shadows to me, they do look a lot better on PC. One issue on PC that I would be interested and seeing them take a look at, is the shadows are actually, there's a bit of a variable penumbra to them, but they are a little bit sharp relative to what you'd expect given the distance and the location of the light source and things like this. There is a bit more of a certain sharpness to them that feels a little bit unnatural. I know it's more expensive to do soft shadows with RT, but maybe that's something we could look at given the fact that the game is already ludicrously kind of very, very expensive on PC already. Maybe they could just pump something like that in there just as a nice little gimme for the full RT experience. That would be nice. But yeah, in the lighting in general, you know, SDFs, I think they look good. They can over darken things for sure. It doesn't look bad. I think it still looks good. Like I have a scene here, like in a kind of grotto area where the PS5 looks a little bit unusually dark. I did note that just playing through that on the PS5. Switch over to PC. It is not quite as over darkened, but which looks better, I don't know, but which looks more realistic, the PC version, I can tell you that much. So yeah, but I think like the overall impression here is that the PS5 version is making kind of like sensible decisions around some of these areas with like the CSMs, software lumen reflection, software lumen indirect lighting, right? It mostly is like holding up okay. It's just that for that kind of next level of fidelity, the PC version is delivering a better experience. I'm not looking at the PS5 version and thinking, oh, they made a really poor choice here with respect to this technique or that technique. I think they're all good techniques that work well in concert. But again, that PC version, on a high-end PC, it's going to push you kind of to the next level.
Yeah, and I think that conclusion there regarding the visuals about the PC kind of just offering like a next tiered level above this explains a little bit about what we're seeing here. The intense PC focus of this game, both that we see looking at the kind of play charts of Steam, as well as I would say the visuals and the performance considerations that you described here, coming to the end of this, looking at it where you kind of see not the greatest balance of visuals, performance, and kind of resolution on the PlayStation 5 version here. I would like, my opinion on this is that the various modes they give you could be better in a lot of ways, with some simple tweaks. For example, I really think the quality mode should have a proper 30 FPS cap, which is possible. I feel like the balance mode could be done maybe at 40 FPS and 120 hertz window with VRR or something like that. In general, also a performance mode that would also maybe leverage VRR, but that doesn't solve the problem of the game necessarily not targeting 60 hertz displays very well in any of these modes in a certain way. And I feel like that is something the developers should really look at. They've balanced the PC version quite well, but the choices and optimizations here and strategies used to get the PlayStation 5 version the way it is right now don't make always a lot of sense to me. And I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a ton of issues. You went over some of them there. I also think the use of frame gen is maybe questionable, but possibly acceptable here. I think the sharpening issue is annoying and kind of, I don't know why it's there, frankly. I don't understand the reasoning for sharpening one 1080p mode much more than the other 1080p mode. I also don't really know what is the balanced mode supposed to bring to the table? Because it is just 1080p. Shouldn't it be some intermediate resolution, targeting an intermediate frame rate like you suggest for 120 hertz displays? Or maybe it should just be a mode that is trying to get to 60 FPS, frame times be damned, instead of trying to cap it at 45 FPS. Why not cap it at 50 FPS if you have to make it operate within VRR? I mean, there are a ton of questions you could ask here. But I think ultimately, like to me, the key conclusion about this game is that the game is very high quality, very good looking. It's absolutely one of the best looking games of the year. Even on PS5, the lighting and models are like a clear step above a lot of comparable action games, including Souls-like games, other Souls-like games. I love the particle effects, I love the animation work, I love the environments. They look fantastic. It looks great in more naturalistic settings. So I think the underlying game is very high quality, and I do expect that they have a long patching cycle ahead of them to hopefully clean up some of those problems. My overall impression of this effort is that it was a PC-first development from developers who don't have a lot of experience making games for consoles, because a lot of the conventions and concessions that console games typically use just aren't here. I also think that, you know, using UE5 probably does complicate their attempts to maybe do a performance mode, which is possibly why FrameGen was used. I think that that's something they might run into as well. But for sure, like, I think the frame rate cap in the balance and quality modes needs to be fixed. That should probably be priority number one. There are a ton of other things, obviously a ton of other things here as well. And at the end here, I just wanted to note a couple of other things that had no place in this video. So one thing, which is not really an issue, but I thought was interesting, is the facial animation is synced with the Chinese audio, not the English audio, which you should be able to tell with this recording here.
And allow you to keep the other two. Because I'd hate to let you miss how I'll slaughter each mongrel of the court.
And yeah, it's not that typical for AAA games to be localized without English lip sync. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think it's perfectly fine. There's not a ton of cutscenes in this game. It's not a super narrative focused game, but I did want to note that because I've not seen that in a while, again, for one of these bigger budget games. Typically, we might see that with smaller AA efforts from various developers, but that is something that's interesting. The last thing that is a genuine technical issue that they should fix this, is that the blacks aren't truly black. The blacks are slightly raised. So you should be able to see with this video scope open in Final Cut Pro that I'll have on the screen here, the darkest parts of the image are not at the darkest point in Rec 709 color space. And I've corrected this image here to have truly black blacks, and you should be able to see the difference on an OLED display, which particularly matters if you have an OLED panel or like a good LCD, a VA LCD, or a LCD with local dimming, maybe on an IPS or TN panel, you will not be able to see this as well. And yeah, there is a brightness setting in game, and you can set it to 0, but the game will still never hit a truly black image, no matter what you change in game. Also, this game does not have HDR, which is going to annoy a lot of players. But I think HDR issues, that's a little bit more complex. I think they should have a good HDR implementation. I think they should patch it in. But for sure, these SDR issues, they could be resolved fairly easily. So that's one thing that I am hoping they fix post-release, in addition to the laundry list of issues that me and Alex have respectively with the PC and PS5 versions of this game.
Yeah, so no version of this game is exactly perfect. I feel like, though, like you described it very well, that this is a developer that seems to have really focused a lot on the PC version and maybe didn't have the experience or knowledge or just knowing exactly what people tend to do with the console game. And I think just with some smaller tweaks, there could be some great results here on the PlayStation 5 version, just like there would be on the PC version with some smaller tweaks. So, Oliver, I think that's the end of this video here. I think we do have a good sense, though, now why the press didn't have good access to that PlayStation 5 version pre-launch. It is playable. I wouldn't ever say the game is unplayable, but for those of you who do like visually smooth games with good input latency, currently it's not in a great place there.
Yeah, it's a great action game. Looks stunning. Terrific, tremendous artistic and visual effort, but technically speaking, there are a lot of issues that probably should be ironed out. Many of them could seemingly be ironed out without a great deal of difficulty from what we understand. But yeah, it's going to be a long patching cycle, and perhaps we can take another look at this game further down the line when they do hopefully resolve some of these problems. Yeah, we definitely will. But thank you, Oliver, for talking to me about your findings here. Thank you, Alex. I guess that's the end of it. So if you did like this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell in the corner, support us on Patreon, follow us on Twitter, and I guess I actually forget how to say goodbye in Mandarin Chinese. Oliver? Auf Wiedersehen? Auf Wiedersehen.